Good morning, almost good afternoon, 1 minute to noon. So I'm going to start introducing the chair and reminding participants that this is a webinar format of Zoom. Just a few quick housekeeping. All participants on the call, and there are over 250 of you, thank you for staying with us. You are all muted and your videos are switched off, so you will be unable to participate in any other way than using the chat function and the Q&A function. If you have a direct question for this panel, please use the Q&A function. We will not be responding to questions in the chat. That's what the Q&A function is for. And please make sure that you make them questions. You can make them general for the whole panel or directed at one panelist. It's probably also best if you hold off till you hear the panelists speak before you fire your questions in there. As you know, I'm the host for the day, but I'm now handing over to the panel chair for this particular panel, which is on using evidence in policy and practice. TESO is a What Works Center, and what we thought we would try to do with this panel is try to bring together some of our sister organizations who have a similar approach in HE and beyond. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Ryan Shorthouse, who's the Chief Executive of Bright Blue, a think tank, and he's also a trustee of TESO and has been a huge support to me and the team as we set up as an independent charity. So over to you, Ryan, and thank you to everyone for being here.
Thanks, Omar, and thank you to everybody who's joined today for the first annual conference of TESO, and I'm delighted to be a trustee of this new addition to the What Works community. I'm already a trustee of the Early Intervention Foundation, but was very enthusiastic and delighted to join as a trustee, because I think strengthening the evidence base around progression into and outcomes from higher education, I think is really crucial, not only for the individuals who go on to higher education, but in quite a controversial political context at the moment, when the value of higher education is being really questioned by a range of politicians and policymakers. So in this first day of the conference, which is looking at the evidence landscape, this particular session is exploring the use of evidence in policy and practice. And we're joined by a great panel of speakers who come from different parts of the What Works community and the evidence community in this space. We'll start with contributions from them, and then we're going to open it up to questions, both from me, although I won't ask too many questions, but also from you in the audience watching. So please, as Omar has already reminded people, please do ask questions through the Q&A chat on Zoom. And we're going for about an hour today in this session. So in terms of the panelists, we're joined today by Jonathan Kay, who's the head of policy at the Education Endowment Foundation, one of the leading What Works centres looking at the evidence around what works in terms of education interventions. We have Anna Smee, who is the chief executive of and co-founder of the Youth Futures Foundation, which was established to mobilise a cross-sector response to rising youth unemployment thanks to the pandemic. And we're also joined by Nancy Hay, who is the executive director of the What Works Wellbeing What Works Centre, and has a long career in the field of wellbeing, where she's known as a leader. So what I'm going to do is ask, firstly, Jonathan to speak for about 8 minutes, and then I'll go to the other speakers. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Ryan. And yeah, thanks for the introduction, and really excited to be here today to talk through our work and also hear more about the excellent work of TESO. So yeah, I'm John Kay. I'm head of policy at the Education Endowment Foundation. We were founded in 2011 with a really clear mission, which was closing the attainment gap for rich and poor pupils in the English compulsory education system. And we were really lucky in the way that we were founded, because we were founded through a £125 million grant from the Department for Education as a completely independent organisation. And we really put evidence at the heart of our mission there. And we engage in essentially 3 distinct but linked activities in an effort to close the attainment gap. So the first of those activities is evidence generation, creating new research, new studies. The second is evidence synthesize, bringing findings together and communicating them really, really clearly. And the third one is evidence dissemination. So what can we do actively to get evidence into the hands of users and to change behaviors and ultimately outcomes for the poorest pupils in our education system? So to talk through those activities in turn, in terms of evidence generation, we came into the education sector in a space that had some research, but research that was a variety of different methodologies. So largely secondary data analysis, largely qualitative studies, largely action research from teachers. And all of those pieces of research are incredibly valuable. But without money, no one was able to do the kind of randomized control trials, the experimental trials that provide a different function in the evidence ecosystem. And so, unlike in medicine, where there's plenty of big pharma firms willing to fund RCTs, that simply doesn't exist in education. And so, with our endowment, we spent a long time running randomized control trials on a variety of different factors in education. So, trialing programs that schools are already purchasing, seeing if they're effective, seeing if they're ineffective. Um, Studies that ministers are often interested in, programs like summer schools, things like breakfast clubs, and finding out whether they work through randomized control trial designs. And one of our most interesting findings is that there is really an appetite to engage with that type of research in the education system. So prior to our existence, you might have been skeptical that schools would be willing to be randomized into a trial and either receive it or not receive it. Actually, at this point, over half of the schools in England have been involved in an RCT that EEF have funded. So that's about 1.6 million pupils have been involved in an EEF trial. And we've been able to build the evidence base in a way that's trusted by schools and trusted by policymakers. And a key ingredient of that is our independence, both from developers and from the policymakers themselves. So we publish everything we do, and the government has no say in what we fund or whether we publish the results of it. The second area that we work in is evidence synthesis. So one trial is not enough, and we try and pull together findings, both of our own research and others, into a really accessible format that can be engaged with by policymakers and by teachers. So our key resource here is a tool called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. If you Google it, it will come up. And this is an evidence portal that summarizes a number of different approaches in terms of impact. So if you give homework to kids, what's the likely impact in terms of their learning? In terms of security, so how many studies have there been of homework? What's the quality of those studies? And in terms of cost, so while homework is free to implement, there are lots of approaches that might be effective, but might not be cost effective, such as reducing class sizes, which is positive, but also incredibly expensive to do. And this has become a really important tool for teachers and policymakers. Our latest survey data shows about 70% of school leaders in England are accessing the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. I'd wager probably a higher percentage of people in the strategy unit at the DFE are accessing it because they're constantly referencing it and building on it. And the key to the success of that tool is really its accessibility. So we take research, we put it in really accessible language, we take it out from behind paywalls, and we are transparent and systematic in the way that we summarize it. So it's both accessible and trusted for teachers and for policymakers. And then the third area of evidence that we do is probably the hardest, which is evidence dissemination. And I think one of the learning journeys we've been on at the EF is that understanding that summarizing evidence in a really accessible way might be a necessary but not sufficient condition for changing behaviors and changing outcomes. We actually did a trial on research use itself. So we did a randomized control trial on the ways that people typically disseminate research findings, things like booklets, things like blogs, things like conferences, ironically enough. And they didn't have an impact on behavior change. They didn't have an impact on attitudes towards research, and they didn't have any impact on people outcomes. And since then, we've really engaged in very active methods of research dissemination. So we now fund a network of research schools that actively disseminate research school to school. And we do things like instrumental use of research. So for example, our research schools run training that are on best practice, but they aren't necessarily on how to use research. They're on the things that are inspired by research so that people can engage in those things without necessarily knowing that it's based on a randomized controlled trial or without knowing that it's based on a systematic review. And those kind of instrumental uses of evidence have become increasingly important in our evidence ecosystem. Obviously, the ideal is that everyone loves evidence, everyone's reading studies, everyone's engaging in that evidence base. But actually, in order to improve outcomes, sometimes you need to use more instrumental forms. Another way that we've used that kind of instrumental approach has been with our engagement with policymakers. So we've always had a very positive relationship with the Department for Education. More and more, we've been involved as a kind of independent quality assurance agent when it comes to things like political reforms. So most recently, they've launched a new thing called the Early Careers Framework, which is an entitlement of training for all new teachers. And they brought in the EEF to come in and quality assure what was included in that entitlement for teachers. And that was a really positive trade-off for us because the government gets the independent EEF stamp of approval on its curriculum, but we get to mobilize research in a way that informs the training of every new teacher in the country and hopefully improves outcomes even for teachers that might have absolutely no interest in research itself. So that's a really powerful partnership that we've had recently. And the other final way that we scale that kind of instrumental evidence use is by scaling programs when we find they have promising results. So if in a trial we find that a program is particularly promising, then we try and bring that to as many schools as possible and try and secure co-funding, secure incentives to encourage teachers and schools to engage in those programs and those activities. So together, the generation, the synthesis and the dissemination form hopefully a really coherent ecosystem that gives us a lot of power to speak to policymakers, to speak to teachers, but ultimately to make a difference in the education system. And as a final reflection, a lot of that is very distinct to the world that we work in. So one of the things we've been very careful of is responding to the English education system, which when we came into existence was a system with a large amount of autonomy, but less high quality information. And so we've really responded to that, which is why primarily we talk to teachers and we make our findings accessible to teachers. Lots of other systems, lots of other what work centres will need to act more directly through policymakers or find different theories of change. And so a final reflection from me is that targeting, that understanding of what are the most effective levers to ultimately reach your goal has been a really important part of the EF journey, but is distinct to every single what work centre.
Great, thanks so much, Jonathan. Very interesting, and particularly your last point on the kind of increased autonomy of schools and how that means that you as an organisation have had to focus much more on decision makers in schools to influence change. And I think for universities, which are even more autonomous than schools, that's a big lesson. Just one quick follow-up question from me, which is, understand that your job is about producing and evaluating evidence on what works, but thinking about what works in terms of influencing decision makers, have you got any kind of evidence or evaluation on that in terms of what really works in getting people to change based on the evidence you've done?
I'm afraid I can't offer up a randomized control trial in the same way that I could on research use more generally. I think probably my biggest reflection is answering the questions that policymakers care about. So the thing that often causes that disconnect, my experience is when the EF has something to say about a question that the DFE is interested in, the DFE will listen to that. And we're lucky, we're in a privileged position. We've developed a reputation as a trusted source. But actually the biggest disconnect between policymakers and research centres tends to be when the research centre goes off and answers the questions that are not necessarily the questions that government actually want answering. And a lot of the positivity there has been because we've been able to engage with that autonomous education system and provide guidance on best practice for schools. That's something that's become quite depoliticised recently and allows us to have those more meaningful conversations with government.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very useful. Anna, if I could pass over to you for your 8 minutes.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Great to be here and lovely to be a part of the What Works network. I'm the Chief Exec of the Youth Futures Foundation, and lots of what Jonathan said really resonated with me. We take a very similar approach, and we recognised early on that it was really important to think about not just how we develop evidence, but who will be using that evidence and how. There's many organisations have gone before us that have produced fantastic repositories of research and evaluations that nobody has read or listened to. And when you talk about schools becoming increasingly autonomous, we're aiming to change the behaviour of people like youth organisations, community centres, employers, including SMEs. They are even more autonomous again. And a lot of people questioned whether we could even do things like randomised controlled trials in this sector, where our mission is to narrow the employment gap for young people from marginalised backgrounds. And we are very conscious that there's an extremely important role of academic attainment in that. But organisations like EEF are already doing great work in that area. So we're particularly interested in the other factors that come into play for young people from marginalised backgrounds. What happens to them in terms of developing their extracurricular interests and their life skills? How do they get access to the right networks? How do we raise aspirations, ensure they have realistic pathways to access the jobs that they really want to be doing? And the reason that this is so important, of course, is because it links directly back to our national productivity. And at a time like this, when we're seeing big increases in unemployment, and as Ryan said, particularly amongst young people, they've borne the brunt of furlough and redundancies as a result of COVID. Our role is becoming more and more important, and will continue to be so, because we anticipate that youth unemployment will probably continue to rise for the next 2 or so years before it starts to fall again. That's been the general trend after previous economic recessions. And this one is even bigger, and so it's very likely to follow a similar pattern. So we need to be getting evidence to the front line really quickly, which is a huge challenge for us. This isn't a case of us setting up and having a 10 or 15-year lead in time to build a global evidence base. We actually need to be collecting that data together really quickly and making sure that people that need to know about it can access it. So we're simultaneously working with our stakeholder groups to ask all of those questions that Jonathan talked about. What form of evidence do they want? What will they actually use? What changes people's behaviour? Are they more influenced by their peer group, or by reading a research report, or listening to a podcast, or seeing something on social media? And at the moment, we're starting to hear back quite different responses to that question from different stakeholder groups. So we'll be making sure that the evidence that we collate and the evaluations that we carry out are disseminated in different ways to those different groups to get cut through. I think building on that link back to productivity, one of the key issues is around skills mismatch, which is particularly pertinent to this audience today, I'd imagine. We know there are big shortages in skills around education and training, health, science, technology, engineering and maths STEM subjects. We also need to be thinking about whether that's where the shortages will be in the longer term as the economy changes in response to COVID. Are we going to be, should young people still be looking for jobs in these areas? And at the moment, those ones I listed, I'd be saying yes. But will the jobs they've historically been able to access be there? Probably not. So the reason that young people were hard hit by this recession is because they typically work in large numbers in hospitality and retail, which were particularly hard hit. Not all of those jobs will come back. We won't see the high street coming back in the same form that it was before. Some of those jobs may move into e-commerce, but our young people leaving school at 18 may not be equipped to access those at the moment. They may not know that they exist or where to find them and how to get into them. So how do we tackle that? So for us, it's all about understanding the evidence, but really making it real, not just being a think tank that's remote from the young people that we're seeking to serve. And the way that we go about doing that is that we talk about identifying evidence of what works, investing into good practice so that we can test whether things work in different scenarios. So it's important for us if we see one evaluation that appears to be effective, for example, in Manchester, would that work if we took that same intervention and delivered it to a cohort of young people in Cornwall? In order to do that, we need to be able to invest into multiple evaluations in different contexts. So looking at different regions, different groups of young people, accessing different sectors of work. And then the final piece is igniting that change, which I've talked about a bit. How do we then get a large group of people who are working directly with young people to change their behaviour? And we look not just at those organisations that are delivering interventions to young people, so that we'd consider those to be practitioners, whether they are university lecturers, teachers, youth workers, community workers, paid for training providers. They all come under the practitioner heading for us, and they are very, very important. In addition, we're really interested in how employers are behaving. So if we get a young person skilled up and ready to apply for a job, and they turn up on the doorstep and the employer won't take them because of their accent, where they come from, the colour of their skin, their gender, then clearly it's about what's happening on the demand side just as much as what's happening on the supply side. So how can we get employers to think differently and recognise the huge value that can be gained from hiring diverse talent and bringing them through into their business and supporting them to progress. And then finally, we look at the whole system. So systems change. Where those two pieces come together, the demand and supply, is where it gets really interesting. How does a young person transition from childhood through training, education into employment and adulthood? And what are the different touch points along the way? So it'd be very unusual for a young person's life to be transformed by one 6-week intervention. It's typically coming together of their experience in formal education, outside of school, in extracurricular activities, through mentors that they may have encountered in their community, through their first job on a weekend or on a holiday, through their first week's work experience, and then their first full-time job or apprenticeship or traineeship. And we're very interested in how that all works and where it's working effectively and where it's not. And we're at the moment doing a big mapping exercise to understand that better and to be able to put our resource where the biggest gaps and challenges are being identified by the young people themselves and by key stakeholders. So in terms of our impact, we're aiming to reduce the employment gap, but also to narrow pay gaps, reduce levels of insecure work, and reduce levels of low pay wherever we can. In terms of existing evidence, there are only around 400 studies into tackling youth employment worldwide at the moment, and a handful of those relate to the UK. So we're coming off a low evidence base. We will be launching a global evidence map this summer, and then continuing to build on that through our own evaluations. Whenever we grant fund an intervention, we always ensure that we also fund a thorough evaluation alongside it. And we take a sort of two-pronged approach to evaluation. So we will do a comparison study or RCT wherever possible, but we will also do a process evaluation. So that enables us to know not just what works, but why it works. So a comparison study might demonstrate that a group of young people have achieved better employment outcomes as a result of an intervention, but it may not be clear exactly why, and that makes it difficult to replicate it. Through doing the process evaluation, we can really make sure we know what it was about that intervention that worked for those young people, and we can make sure that we replicate the most effective parts of the intervention when we seek to expand it to a wider cohort of young people. I know I'm nearly out of time, but a quick run through of some things that we know do work, which actually have quite interesting crossover, I think, for supporting young people into higher education as well. So in terms of getting them into jobs, it's all about accurate identification, so understanding which young people need the most support. Using magnets, so fun stuff, how do you hook them in to the conversation and participating in extra training and transitioning into work, which might be through sport, or through the arts, through music, through their peers, and being involved in exciting activities with trusted people. The support needs to be personalised. They really benefit from working with trusted, consistent advisors throughout their journey into employment and during the first 6 to 12 months of employment. And then in-work support once you're on the job is really important. And I think a lot of those apply to young people transitioning from school to university. Similarly, we need to identify the young people that need extra support. We need to find fun, engaging ways to get them interested in transitioning to higher education. We need to personalise the support for them, recognise that the experience is very different for someone in a rural area who can't afford the bus fare to somebody in a city who perhaps just doesn't relate to the people attending an institution just across the road from them. And that consistent advice and support as they go through that transition. And then all those same factors apply again, of course, when they graduate and they're seeking to look for work. And then there are some interesting things around things like wage subsidies and temporary paid jobs that enable young people to transition into permanent work. And that's why we were big supporters of Kickstart, which absolutely hits that very effectively. That's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Anna. Very, very, very interesting stuff. Just one question I have is around the employment gap. And I think all of us speaking and watching this are interested in diversifying the intakes, both into whether it's universities or into particular workplaces, people from different ethnic and social backgrounds. And I'm interested now in what seems to be a bit of a kind of divergence in how you do it. So one approach is a kind of contextualized admissions, as it were, which is you take into account the person's background and other social characteristics when you make a decision about whether you admit that person into a university or into a workplace. But then there's another approach now, which is seeming to surface, which is about blindness, which is actually we should have name blind, CV blind, gender blind admissions. But of course, that removes the contextual information that you need. So I'm just wondering, what's the right approach? Is it a more contextualized approach, or is it more a blind approach, or is the evidence still quite nascent on that?
It's a fantastic question. The answer is there isn't clear evidence on this yet, and it's something that we're looking into at the moment. And I'm also not an expert on kind of university admissions as opposed to securing jobs. But I would say that, you know, from our experience so far, and we've only been up and running for just over a year, I think you really need a blend of those two things, actually, and I'd be interested to see if the evidence supports that or not when it comes out, because you're quite right, there are real challenges in doing things completely blind. And you know, we've observed, for example, it depends on the role. So if people are applying for roles that require, you know, for example, a head of policy role, where typically you'd need somebody to be very good at literacy and you have fantastic grasp of language, be very eloquent, you can sometimes see when you go through blind applications that actually there's a big skew towards people from more advantaged backgrounds. Whereas if you gave somebody the opportunity to get into that job and learn on the job, then a very bright person from a more disadvantaged background might very quickly catch up and potentially overtake in their ability to do that role. In other jobs, it's less obvious. So if you're in more of like a data-driven situation, the kinds of ways that people ask questions when they're doing applications and going through CV sifting tend to be more verbal. So there's a less clear-cut, it's a less clear-cut situation until you get to the point where people are set tasks. So yeah, I mean, something we're really keen to explore more, and hopefully I'll have a better answer for you in due course.
No, it's very interesting. Okay, so I know questions are coming in, so thank you. Please keep sending them in. We've got one more panelist for their opening remarks. So over to you, Nancy.
Thanks, Ryan. And it's brilliant to hear colleagues from other What Works centres talk. It's one of the things that we feel like we should do more of, but don't get the opportunity. So brilliant to be here. So I'm Nancy Hay. I'm the Executive Director and Founding Director of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. The centre aims to improve wellbeing and reduce inequality, reduce misery, and by understanding what organisations can do to improve wellbeing. And those organisations can be in the public sector, so governments, national, devolved, local, the broader public institutions. They can be in the business sector, so employers, and it can also be in the community sector, so everything from trusts and foundations to charities, but also to community groups and communities themselves who may not think of themselves as an organised group. And we try and work out what they can do, what impact they're having, and how we can learn from that effectively. And we do that particularly working across the What Works network, so we look across the life course, but we particularly focus on working age, which is why I'm really pleased to be here with colleagues working with those on working age. We've looked at student wellbeing, graduate wellbeing, wellbeing at work and job quality, and the transitions between education and employment, and particularly the importance of employment and job quality for young people. So this is why today is important. But we also look at community and connection, particularly loneliness, and the local conditions that we're in, and methodology, and you'll see why that's important shortly. My background is also 10 years in better law and better policy making, so I'm going to draw on that as I talk about how we use evidence in policy and practice. And I have a few slides just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So policy making, as I understand it, is about decision making in the context of the public and social sector. So it's what and how the public and social sector do what they do. And therefore, policy makers, which we often think of as ministers particularly, are a broad group of people of which we're all part. So it's elected officials of all different types, but it's also officials, heads of policy, it's analysts, it's researchers, it's also funders and decision makers in all different types of contexts when you think of it like that. And so what we think of when we think of successful policies is when we bring the evidence, the politics and the delivery together. So I'm just going to show you a quick slide about what I mean from that here. So this is what the policy profession understands the effective policy skills to be. So effective policies bring together the evidence, the politics and the delivery. And often politics and the sort of central government things like a spotlight on a decision, we need to make a decision now, and it needs that evidence quickly and it needs it in a form that it can understand. This is kind of a concept of open policy making. And for me, what works evidence focuses very much, if you think of it as a Venn diagram of politics, evidence and delivery, what works is very much around the evidence around what's doable. So that's kind of what we're going to do. That's where I'm coming from at it. And what is the aim of this? We're aiming to have safe and effective solutions, right? And it also helps if they are affordable, sustainable and scalable. But ultimately, do they do harm? And do they do what you intended them to do? And how do you know? Ultimately, I would say the aim of all this is improve societal well-being, but often you're focused on a very specific bit of it. Does it improve early intervention? Does it improve graduate outcomes? What is it that you're focusing on? And is it effective at doing that? And does it cause harm? And then how can we get this from innovation to scale to sustainability? The What Works Centre's role, and we've talked a little bit about this, and again, I'm going to show a slide just to illustrate this point. Is evidence synthesis. So Jonathan talked quite a lot about this, is that we have a tendency to look at studies that confirm what we already know is true. I've chosen two that some of us may particularly like to see, and often small studies are reported with massive headlines, and we try and understand, so we call this evidence literacy, understanding what it is. And actually COVID has been amazing for that. I've seen national newspapers cover quality of evidence in a way I've never seen before. But also people who are in policy and practice are expert in what they do. And we would want that they're busy people doing delivery things. That if you're in a charity, you're doing everything from meeting participants, doing the marketing, everything else in one go, doing evaluation. You're busy doing what you want to do. Doesn't mean you don't understand important and sensible things, but you probably understand it in the same way as an average intelligent person. And in the court system, we discovered that the average 12-year-old understands the same as what's going on in the court as the average adult. So pitching it as a sort of general accessible resource for someone who's busy but intelligent and needs to use it is important. So that's what evidence synthesis does, and it has a particularly important role in brokering it. So this is a paper that I'd highly recommend on the importance of evidence synthesis for policy making, and how you bring together a body of knowledge and understand how confidently you can rely on those different findings is really important. And the Education Endowment Foundation are really at the heart of this, but they're working from a much more established evidence base than we are in policy making, in well-being, for example. And then what Works' role is also about understanding how we know this stuff, which is the methodology. And I can see a number of questions in the chat about quants and qual and RCTs. And so when we're doing evidence synthesis at What Works Wellbeing, we do evidence synthesis using GRADE, which does quantitative evidence, but we also use SERQUAL, which synthesizes qualitative evidence. And we're in the process of just understanding how you give the best advice to understand how you can do the best evidence, qual or quant, based on where you are and what you're doing. So if what we found with the loneliness evidence, for example, is that people had rushed to RCT when they needed to do earlier stage evaluations. So we have a range of different methodologies and a way of understanding that and a way of building up the system from innovation to replication to scaling to rolling out. So that's the evidence side of it. we're different from think tanks or research centres in that we also are bridges of knowledge brokers. So we want evidence that is used, people want to use it and can use it, and they can take action to make a difference, and actually that they can learn from that when they're doing it. And professions are amazing at this. So I'm going to show you again a few more slides. Here we go, just a little pause while I do that. So effective knowledge brokers, which is what we are at What Works Centres, has to be robust. It cannot be anything but robust, but it also needs to be relevant and useful and communicated well. And you need to make sense of it, which is the narrative. And working with professions is one of the most effective ways to do that, because professions are inspired to pull that knowledge down. But you can see the different bits, but we also need to do the infrastructure around evidence use. You asked earlier, Ryan, about whether there was an evidence base for knowledge use, and actually we started the centre from this, and you can see here this is the what works for knowledge use, and you can see there's 6 different mechanisms for doing that, and we use evidence in that way, and we work across the What Works network to improve that. So recently we've been working with the Early Intervention Foundation to understand how you use different methodology about making things visible, how you use learning, how you use integration through structures, so getting measures in the right place, and how you get that communication around knowledge to happen. So I'll just stop sharing. And my final point is around how you create a learning system, which is what you're trying to create here, where you've got policy, practice and evidence all working together on equal terms to understand how we can make the best impact. So you're building that system, which ecosystem which was described, but that requires relationship. It requires us to have a mutual respect, mutual freedom of expression and mutual trust about what each person has a role in the system. So building those relationships and making sure everyone has equal voice in that conversation about what creates what we know and what we don't know, and how we find out about what makes a difference. So that's what we're trying to do at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and how we do it. I've just focused quite specifically on the what we know and how we do it, and not specifically on the wellbeing evidence, but I'm happy to talk about that later if that's useful.
Great, thank you, Nancy. That's really helpful. I think all speakers are involved in the kind of production and promoting of good evidence. A lot of the people who are watching today are involved in the adoption of the evidence. And it was interesting, Nancy, you put the slide up about the red wine studies in the Daily Mail. And, you know, sometimes I think people can be faced with information or evidence overload. So for people out there, you know, who hear lots of different stories or news stories or from other people, you know, this is what we're doing, or this is the best thing to do to improve access to my institution and improve diversity of access to my institution. What would you say are kind of good guidelines for, you know, here's a healthy skeptical approach to, you know, whether I agree, whether I adopt this what's being said in this kind of paper or communications that's being sent to me?
It's a really good question. How do you make sense of this information that comes at you? And it's a bit like understanding when it's a marketing spin of 8 out of 10 women recommend this hair product, whether I'm telling a story about what we do as an example. So we call them practice examples rather than case studies, but they could also be that. This is what we do. What I often see at early stage evidence is people giving quotes about this is the impact it would have. And I think knowing... So one of the problems that areas that have a strong evidence culture have is that they'll go, oh, there's no evidence of that, it therefore can't be true, which health often do. And where there's no evidence, it doesn't mean that what this thing is doesn't work. It means that we don't know yet, or we don't know how it works yet. And I think that that's the question we should be looking for. So how confident can we be that what they've said is an effective thing? And so you'd be looking for how many people were involved, how they knew, how they talk about the stage at which they're doing it. So we're trying this out and therefore we're just having a go, or we were confidently taking something that we know works elsewhere and seeing if it worked here. And we did that and we looked at the findings we have. And you want to see a study eventually, you'll want to see an article linked to it, but just having an academic article linked doesn't always mean it's a good thing. And so in knowing whether it's a bigger study the better, the more repeated that study the better, but sometimes you're at a really early stage and you're just going, oh, is that a practice example that's happening there? And knowing when something is innovative and where actually all you should be expecting is someone just showing you the example. We talk about this as an evidence journey and how we know that, but certainly questioning why are they saying that, or what have they claimed, how do they know what they know, is quite a useful, and how does it fit into the other things that we know and who else would know it. So that's where what work centres are able to show you how well you know something and how confident you should be and whether something is useful to know at that stage.
Yes, the stamp of the approval from what work centres is a useful kite mark, I think. Okay, so let's open it up to questions from the floor. Lots are coming in, so thank you for that. I'm going to take some. So I'm going to start with Rena, who has asked, how do we bridge the gap between the digital strategies required in all sectors of education and the research evidence-based impact, with a sense of speed and tenacity? This is needed for an evolving employment sector. And of course, what's happened over the last year, we've had to respond very speedily as well. Jonathan, what's your view on that? Because there is sometimes, emergencies, crises emerge, and you need to respond very quickly. And sometimes good evidence takes time to come through. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think it certainly is a challenge that good evidence takes a long time. Over the last 12 months, we've explored a number of methodologies that can be a bit more responsive. So when COVID hit, we led a remote learning rapid evidence assessment that tried to collect information very, very quickly from a number of sources. The challenge is making sure that you caveat it appropriately and that you explain where you're saying indicative findings rather than concrete findings that are well understood and well established. I think particularly on digital technologies, this is an area where evidence and fads can be a real kind of thing that happens a lot, particularly in education. So we constantly, over the last 5 years, have had ed tech companies that have come in and said, we've got this brilliant new digital product that definitely works and we've evaluated it. But what they mean by that is they've got some participant data of people that have taken part rather than it having any real impact. And I think that evidence has a real role here to kind of speaking truth to that and to managing where people are making those claims. And the thing that we found across all digital technology in education is typically it's not the tech itself that makes the difference, it's the practice that's happening, being implemented with that technology. So yeah, I think it's really important that evidence is responsive, and we explore a number of methodologies that try and be as quick, as responsive as possible. But there is also a place for that long-term rigorous evaluation, particularly with new and emerging technologies that can be adopted because they're the exciting thing rather than because they're the effective thing.
Great, thank you. That's really useful. I'm going to take two other questions now, and I'm going to take them together because I think they're related, and that's from Cheryl Reynolds and Duna Sabri, which is around the utility of different types of quant and qual evidence. And obviously randomized control trials are kind of a gold standard, but they're incredibly expensive. So what do you say about the kind of merits of different quant and qual techniques? Perhaps Nancy, you want to come in on that?
So quant and qual techniques. So we really value qualitative evidence, particularly at earlier stages of the journey, and also for answering particular questions. So what they're particularly helpful to understand is what works for whom, when, how, and how you're, what is actually happening. And they're particularly helpful in understanding what I might call pre-clinical trial territory, where you're trying to understand how mechanisms are happening. So we use them a lot to draw up theories of change, and then you can look at things that you can test within that theory of change. So we did one recently on volunteering, for example, also lots of other different areas. But there's lots of different types of qualitative evidence, and there's ways of doing it well or better for the different context as well. And again, like in quant, you can have a sense of whether something's an indicative finding, as in it's a small type of study with a particular methodology, or whether it's a well-established, really robust type of information. So there's ways of understanding that different qual. We're at the moment trying to get a sense of how you advise projects or other organisations about how you best choose the qualitative methodology that fits your context and what would usefully add to the evidence. I don't think we know that in quite the same way unless you're quite an extensive expert in it. But there's some fantastic qual evidence out there, really, really good for understanding what's going on and therefore what you can change in particular. I'm happy to share some of our qual methodology if that's useful.
Great, thank you. I must say I made a little mistake there. That was actually questions from Mandy Crow and Cheryl Reynolds about quant and qual evidence. So taking those together. So thank you, and hopefully that's useful from Nancy. So I will now take the question from Duna Sabri, which I think is very interesting, which is, given the decentralization and autonomy of youth services and schools, what avenues are open to you to bring about whole system rather than piecemeal change? That's quite an interesting question. Maybe Anna, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, that is the question. So if anyone has the silver bullet answer, please do get in touch. It's challenging, is the answer, and actually it's challenging also in terms of the kind of evidence and evaluation approach that we take. As Nancy was just talking about, we also think carefully about using qualitative approaches as well as very robust RCTs at the far end, because many of the organisations we work with simply don't work with big enough cohorts of young people to be able to do a thorough RCT. We're hoping that we'll be able to take them on that journey to get to a point in 2 or 3 years' time when they can. But where it's possible, we do that. Where it's not, we support them with earlier and alternative approaches. So in terms of then getting that evidence adopted, we have similar challenges. There isn't a clear network that we can push out through, but there are multiple well-established networks that we can work in partnership with. So we're funding a range of infrastructure organisations right across the employability space that we think have good cut through and have built up strong networks of delivery organisations over many years. We're keen to do everything in partnership because we are the new kids on the block, and it would be incredibly arrogant for us to think that we've got all the answers here, and we certainly don't have the networks yet to be able to influence change on the ground. So for us, it's really important to be working through people like Enabling Enterprise, the National Youth Agency, UK Youth, the Gypsy Roma Traveller Community, a whole range of different network organisations that have credibility and trust from their members and can have these conversations at a very practical level on the ground, saying, yes, we understand resource constraints, we know the challenges you're facing, we know you're working with diverse groups of young people where one thing may work for some of them and it doesn't work for others, and we know that you have to prioritise where you spend your time and money. In that context, therefore, working with the Youth Futures Foundation, our recommendation would be that these bits of evidence are most relevant to you. So a lot of it is translating very complex things into simple bite-sized chunks that can be easily adopted as well. And in my previous role, I spent a lot of time travelling all around the UK, sitting down in youth clubs and community centres, 9, 10 o'clock in the evening, and seeing the fantastic work that they do. And these are highly skilled people that absolutely know their target audience. They know the young people, they understand their community, they know the jobs that are available, they know the teachers, they're providing a bridge. They just don't have time to go and read 120-page research reports. They need somebody to make it simple and easy for them so that they can get on with doing the job that they were hired to do. But do it to the best of their ability in a well-informed way. So I think for us, it's being humble and recognising that we're building on strong foundations. We're hoping to just slightly tweak people in a direction that will get even better outcomes for them rather than coming in with a sledgehammer. And it's going to take time. We have to take a very long-term approach on this. We have to take government with us, and we have to kind of build trust between the different key stakeholder groups here and help employers to understand that the young people they want to reach out to are part of networks in their communities. They just need to find those networks and connect with them. And then we could achieve good things.
Brilliant. Well, we've got some great questions coming through, very geeky, and I like that because geeks save the world. So this is a very geeky session. I'm very pro that. So we've got a question here from Musharat, 2 questions. So the first is on RCTs, and again, this is coming up quite a bit. You know, if we're saying this is the only, you know, this is the best and only kind of research base, are we excluding other things? And indeed, also got people talking about the value of practice wisdom as well, and thinking about other quant and qual techniques. And then Musharat also talks about, you know, have you carried out research that is citizen-led and delivered, e.g. citizen researchers? Jonathan, maybe you want to come back on those 2 points.
Yeah, sure. And I completely agree. We shouldn't keep talking about RCTs as the gold standard. I think they're a methodology that's appropriate for answering specific research questions. And I don't like pyramids of evidence that say certain things are at the top, certain things are at the bottom. I much prefer a conception of what is the most appropriate methodology to answer the question that you want to answer. So when you're understanding about feasibility, about acceptability, about theory, there are many methodologies that are much better than RCTs. We had a great example at EEF where we tried to fund a randomized controlled trial of later start times at school. And we needed to recruit 100 schools that were going to decide they're either going to be randomized to have school start at 10 or keep their current start time. 2 schools signed up because you can't randomize those kind of things. You need to know what time your school's going to be starting the next year. It can't be based on the flip of a coin. So RCTs just aren't possible in lots of things, but they also, you know, as both Nancy and Anna have pointed out, don't answer lots of the questions you need to know. So having a really high quality qualitative approach alongside any RCT, I think should be a prerequisite. So just getting a black box with an impact result isn't enough and doesn't answer the questions that you want to answer. So I think particularly when thinking about transferability, and that's not just at early stage, that's when you're looking at those larger studies, and also thinking about the impact on different groups of people. So quite frequently, RCTs really fail to power for subgroup impacts or for impacts of disadvantaged pupils, for example. And having a kind of theoretical basis of understanding potential barriers and the mechanisms by which an activity impacts people is fundamental to understanding transferability. So I completely agree. RCTs are not the only approach, but they are one approach. And I think at the EEF, we've done a lot of RCTs. And part of that is we're conscious that if we don't do them in education, no one else will, because we're in a kind of blessed position where we've got the funding that enables us to do them. So we want them to be part of the architecture, but we definitely don't want them to be the only part. So I think that's really important. And then very briefly on the kind of citizen-led research, involving people, involving stakeholders in research is crucial. I know Anna's done a lot of work on this in terms of engaging stakeholders in things like evidence mapping, but I think having perspectives of, in our case, often teachers, when you're doing things like systematic reviews is really important. And there's also been a number of approaches that we've funded, which have been school-led pilots that we've then developed into programs that could be evaluated at efficacy level.
Great, thank you. There's been a lot of sort of feedback about RCTs, so I'm sure your answer will provide some reassurance that they are an important part, but not the only part of the evaluation landscape. Anna, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, just briefly to say, we've also done some of that peer research. So we did one piece of research in partnership with Versity, which used young people as the researchers, asking other young people about their experiences of finding work during COVID at the end of 2020. And we currently have a piece of research out in the field in partnership with Clearview Research, which is a predominantly young person-led organisation that engages young researchers again to ask their peers. So yeah, we absolutely support that approach as one additional tool in our What Works armoury.
Excellent. What I'm going to do now is just take a few more questions because we are running out of time. So one interesting question which has just come in from Mary Mahoney asks, is there a What Works Centre or network that focuses on evidence on what works for adults rather than schools and young people, please? Obviously Nancy's outfit particularly does that. But I suppose what Mary might be implying here is around kind of lifelong learning and training in particular. Is there one, or is there a need for one? Nancy?
So I guess we look at working age, so that's adults broadly, and we look at the well-being of them in terms of their mental and physical health, partner relationships, and employment, and particularly job quality. So we do a lot of what works in terms of job quality in the workplace, but actually lots of the What Works centres cover aspects of adult life depending on what is of particular interest. So there's the What Works Local Economic Growth, which looks at employment training and a whole range of different contexts, and then there's also NICE, which is the health one, which will look at adult health, and the Early Intervention Foundation will also look at partner relationships between couples and families. So there are lots of different aspects of working life and of adult life, and there's also Centre for Aging Better, which will, although it sounds like it's working on later life, actually it works down to sort of 40s and 50s as you prepare for a good later life as well. So we've done work on retirement, we've done work across that. I think it depends which aspect of adult life that you're thinking of, but there's probably something within the What Works network that does it.
Okay, I mean, maybe I'll come to Jonathan on this, which is specifically on this issue around training, whether it's upskilling or reskilling for adults. Is that something that you look at, or do you think there is a bit of a gap?
I think there is a gap, and actually recently, I think it was Social Mobility Commission funded a systematic review in this area, looking at kind of FE and above and adult vocational qualifications, and they found that there was a real lack of high quality evidence, and one of their recommendations in that report was to call for a new What Works centre that looked at further education and adult vocational learning and lifelong learning. I would be very much in favour of it happening. I certainly think it is a gap. And if it does happen, it should certainly be something that has enough funding to generate new evidence. So I think sometimes there's a tendency for lots of new What Works centres to be created that then don't receive enough funding to actually generate the evidence and build evidence in particular spaces. And I think if there is to be a new What Works centre that looks at that, having that ability to generate new evidence is particularly important, because from what I've seen, there's some evidence from the United States, but very, very limited high quality evidence in English lifelong learning.
Great, and I should also just do a shout out for TASO, who I think today actually have just published a report on mature learners and what they look for from the university experience, so please do check that out. As we're coming towards the end, I just want to ask a final question, and it kind of really flows from some of the kind of nervousness around RCTs, so not a kind of outright rejection of RCTs, but saying they should be an important, one of many evaluation techniques. And is there a danger? I'm just thinking of the Treasury here, which is if you stress evidence too much, does it become quite exclusionary and kind of thwarting of innovation? You can just imagine the Treasury official sat there and say, well, we're not going to try that because there's no evidence behind it. But it's a bit of a sort of chicken and egg situation, which is if you've got a brand new project and you want to try that out, and then you want to scale it up to show if it's effective, well, Treasury or a funder says, well, you haven't really given us high quality evidence enough. Can that insistence on evidence stifle innovation? Jonathan?
I think it can if it's done badly. I definitely don't think we should have a world in which, in order to fund anything or make any kind of decision, you need a randomized control trial, not least because it would take 3 years to make any policy decision in that world because it takes so long to do an RCT. I think there are appropriate evidence to decision frameworks where you consider what is the scope of the decision being made, what is the cost of the decision, and then what type of evidence do we require in order to make an informed decision. So if you were going to completely restructure the education system, or if you were going to mandate a massive change to all schools in the education system, I'd want some pretty good evidence before you made that decision. But with other things, which are minor changes, which are minor iterations, or giving schools freedom to make decisions, I don't think you need a big evidence base. And I think you can draw from different levels of evidence. And as long as that's done appropriately and consistently, I think that's important. I think one of the things that's been a kind of theme amongst the conversations is RCTs offer some things, but not everything. One of the things I think is really good about RCTs is the pre-specification elements of them. So the idea that we want to try and remove bias, the idea that we want to try and remove just our opinion from things, I think is really important. But that is something that can be applied to lots of different types of research. So good qualitative research will set out its research questions, set out its methodology in advance. So I think there's something about taking some of the lessons about rigor, transparency, and process from RCTs and applying it to decision making, both at government and when assessing the quality of other pieces of evidence, that could mean we remove some of the politicization of decisions, but don't end up just closing the shop for anything that hasn't had an RCT.
Sorry, I was just going to add that I think the big area for opportunity here is evidence of what doesn't work. So where people come with a kind of new innovative idea, and you can look and clearly say, actually, there are key components of this that have been evidenced not to work. It prevents wastage and spending money on the wrong things. But you're quite right, there are big gaps in evidence where we just don't know. And in that situation, I think we just need to be really honest about that and say, actually, we don't know yet. I would fully concur with Jonathan in that case. It depends on the size of investment you're talking about, and whether you make an informed decision about risk.
And Nancy, finally to you.
Yeah, I want to agree both with Anna and Jonathan, but also want to add two other things. So one is that when I've worked on innovation funds, we see two things. One is that things that aren't innovative at all, they're just, somebody just didn't know that the other evidence base existed. So that's common. You need to know what the existing evidence is to know whether something's innovative or not. The other is that when things don't work, the findings aren't published, and therefore you get repeated trials of things that just don't work, but because they didn't think to publish it, they don't see that so it looks innovative because it looks like no one's done it before. It's because no, it doesn't work and it's not worth taking any further. But what we've done in this context, particularly wellbeing at work, is that we've gone back to principles, because this is a new context. So we know some stuff from people who've worked in remote or isolated conditions for a long time, so we can take some learning from that. But we go back to what are the principles that we know here, what is a sensible thing to do in this context, and what is the next sensible step on the evidence journey to know whether or not it is. So I very much agree with Jonathan and Anna on how confident you can be based on the knowledge, but we should not say, and which often happens where there's no evidence, that we shouldn't do something at all. We should just use an appropriate risk. And actually, one of the things I see is calls for legislation for something that is completely innovative, or rolling out something across a massive workforce that actually we don't know anything else about. I can give some couple of examples on that, but just wanted to point out those two proper traps I see on innovation funds.
Excellent stuff. Really, really detailed, interesting comments there. And I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope everybody who is watching at home has also learned at home. So learned a lot. So it's lunchtime. I don't think there's any evidence on how best to use your 1 hour lunch break. So you're free to use it as you want. And just to say that the next session is at 2 p.m, which is indeed on how we support and extend opportunities for mature students in higher education on the back of today's report from ASO. Just finally say, and am I passing on to you, Omar, or shall I just say thank you to the speakers?
I think you can, as it's an hour lunch break. I was just going to remind people, but I think you've already done that. The only thing I wanted to say as well is to TASO, we do see overlap, some of those questions that were coming up about adult learners between all three of you on this panel. So we're very grateful you're here today. But I think, thinking about well-being for graduates as a graduate outcome, the graduate outcomes tends to focus on the labor market, not on well-being. thinking about some of the work that Jonathan and the EF are doing that might also be interesting to look longitudinally about the impacts for learners later on, or summer schools, which we also are doing some work on. And finally, with Anna, I think the question of graduate outcomes, one of our themes at TESO is going to be the labor market. And we do very much need to look at graduate and non-graduate outcomes. And I think working with Anna. So I suppose this is also an appeal to the three of you, not just to come speak at our conference, but to come work with us in the coming year. But I'll let Ryan, you do the thank yous and sign off till 2 o'clock.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Omar. That's good stuff. And a particular thanks to Nancy, Anna, and Jonathan for your very interesting and very detailed thoughts. So nice to see everybody, and enjoy your lunch.